We Care expands upon the idea of self-care and self-compassion to bridge its principles and practices with scientific insights about our social nature. And so in contrast to, self-care alone or self-compassion alone, We Care means caring for a we. And importantly, that we is flexible. So if we can hold both self-care and care for others in our minds and in our hearts simultaneously, and then allow that to serve as a kind of dynamic tension that helps us to navigate moment by moment and not lose sight of either commitment to ourselves or commitment to others.
That was Jordan Quaglia on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, a coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of Act Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie. I loved this conversation you're about to listen to with Jordan Quaglia. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Please stick around to the end of the episode to hear my discussion with Michael about this topic and about the episode. And just a quick reminder that you can have an ad-free listening experience if you support Psychologists Off the Clock on Patreon. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy. Jordan Quaglia, PhD, is the author of Self-Care to We Care, the new science of mindful boundaries and caring from an undivided heart. Jordan has spent over a decade researching and teaching on topics such as mindfulness, compassion, and boundaries. He is an associate professor of psychology at Naropa University, where he directs the Cognitive and Affective Science Laboratory and is research director for its Center of the Advancement of Contemplative Education. In addition to his research, Jordan co-developed and regularly teaches an 8-week compassion training curriculum for hundreds of individuals. He lives with his wife in Boulder, Colorado. Welcome, Jordan. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I loved your book, and I want to frame the conversation today by starting with one of the main ideas in your book that has some personal relevance in my just day-to-day life. And in fact, I don't even think I realized what was going on until I read it in your book. So first of all, thank you for writing it, because it's very deep, and I think is a very impactful book. So I really appreciate that, Jordan.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thanks for saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the issue is that I always think of this as a conflict that I have in my life between the responsibility that I have to take care of other people, right? So my kids, my therapy clients, my parents, spouse, friends, just the greater good of the world. So that caring responsibility, and that's an important value to me. But it always feels like a conflict that I have between that and caring for my own needs, right? To have downtime and sleep and exercise and just take care of my own life and goals. And it feels like every day I'm making choices about this, right? And it really does feel like a conflict, like an either or. But in your book, you propose that looking at it in that way, right, as these kind of oppositional forces isn't necessarily helpful. So I was wondering if we could start by having you talk a little bit about what is the problem with looking at it in that kind of either or way.
Yeah. You've highlighted something right away that's so essential to the We Care framework that we'll be talking about, and central to my book's themes. And I think that you're far from alone in this experience of feeling this kind of inner conflict on a daily basis, on an ongoing basis, a moment-to-moment basis sometimes, right? Between do I prioritize myself in this moment, or do I lean in and prioritize others or my work, which often for people is an extension of their care for others. And within the book, I emphasize that sort of the fundamental problem with our self-care culture, and including our culture, I think, about how we talk about things like healthy boundaries, is what I call the either-or mindset that you're highlighting here. And specifically an either-or mindset around self-care and care for others. And so I think we have this view that we're either doing one or we're doing the other. So when we're doing self-care, it's all about ourselves, and we're nourishing ourselves, we're looking out for ourselves, we're, doing that hobby that we really love. When in truth, if we just zoom out a little bit, we can see that that act of self-care is in relationship with our care for others. And similarly, when we're caring for others, we often have this experience that that's sort of exclusively what we're doing. Whereas if we zoom out just a little bit, we can see that that act of care for others is strengthening the social fabric of our life and often has very direct personal benefits. In the moment, it feels good. Not always, but sometimes. And even if it doesn't feel good in the moment, it often longer term sort of has these feedback loops that nourish us and support us too. So it doesn't take much, I think, effort to get beyond this either or mindset. But our habitual tendency, and we could talk about why that might be from an evolutionary perspective, as well as from societal conditioning, is to think about these things as two separate activities. And so I consider that to be sort of the core problem with our self-care movement, as I mentioned. And I think that another way of talking about it that people may be familiar with is a zero-sum mindset about care. And so we have this sense that somehow when we practice self-care, that's trading off against our care for others. Like it's somehow subtracting that from that care bucket of our care for others when we're practicing self-care. Actually, the truth is it's usually additive. It's a positive sum scenario to practice self-care. And so, I just really connect with and relate to, and it's an ongoing practice to notice when we're in that kind of either or mindset about our care, and then kind of explore the spectrum of possibilities that I refer to in the book as hidden choices that lie between, those kind of divided modes of self-care and care for others. I think the last thing that I'll say on this point, which is really essential, is that it's at these extremes of the care continuum that we find the unhealthy aspects of both self-care and care for others. So when we're in these divided modes of care, it's not trivial. When we're practicing self-care in an overly divided way, we see its indulgent or selfish manifestations. And I don't think you're falling into that, but that sometimes happens, right?
Occasionally I do. Not often. I wish.
Yeah, it's
Sometimes
good.
I wish.
It's good
but
that
no,
we can be honest with ourselves about that.
Yeah.
I think we all fall into that at times where our self-care actually becomes a bit self-indulgent and maybe is taking us away from connection or an opportunity for connection that would actually support us more personally. And on the other extreme is when we get so into other focused mode, so into other oriented care that we're neglecting self-care. That one tends to be more familiar with people. I think it's more common to talk about the negative sides of that experience and to admit to them. And probably there are social reasons that it's easier for us to admit to that kind of extreme. But in my book, I'm really problematizing both sides of that care continuum and arguing that what's most essential is that we avoid that kind of either or mode around our care. And we try and find these middle opportunities that aren't compromising the quality of our self-care or care for others. They're actually adding value to both.
So I was hoping we could talk a little bit about those extremes. So maybe we'll take a second to do that. So for example, this idea of the selfish self-care or that indulgent, what might that look like? Or how would you know if you're in that territory?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's difficult to discern, I think for a lot of us, and the social repercussions of it might be the clearest signal. So if we're practicing self-care in a way that's causing sort of ripples, in our social life where people are saying, hey, you prioritized yourself in that moment that was really important for us to, be connected or something like that. That might be a clear signal, if people were reliably getting that kind of feedback. Of course, we have to be careful about this because it's important for us to look after our own needs and to prioritize ourselves. And sometimes we're going to be in the context of environments and relationships where other people are going to push against that for their own needs and interests. So I don't think that's the only signal. I think probably the clearest thing internally is, are we able to, as we're practicing self-care, feel awake to our care for others? So this is what I emphasize most in the book, is sort of developing this awareness from the inside out. And so it's more about, are we losing sight of our care for others? And can we sort of clearly trace a line between this moment of self-care or this act of self-care and our commitments to others? It's not that we have to sort of come up with an ulterior motive to every act of self-care that we do and sort of reframe it as actually instrumental to, our care for others or something to that effect. But if we're in the mode like you are of examining that, then we can examine it by asking ourselves some questions like that. Like, is this act of self-care something that I can see and trace a line with how it's supporting my activities in the world and my care for my family or my loved ones? Or is it the case that maybe this act of self-care is, acting out a pattern or a habit that I know is not good for, others in my life and probably not good for me over the long term as well. So I think it's those kind of basic questions. And yeah, I think that it's ideally our self-care is supporting our care for others, or at least neutral to our care for others. And so the most unhealthy aspects of self-care come in when our self-care actions are harmful to others. And so those are the most important things that we pay attention to. An example, I try and stay away from examples in this territory from real life, because when we look at other people and their practices of self-care, we may assume things. And actually, this happens quite a bit, where we project onto them that their acts of self-care are selfish because of, how it looks to us. Whereas when we're doing some kind of similar behavior, we understand its interconnection with our care and commitments to others. And so we're much less likely to judge those acts of self-care. But the show Parks and Recreation, I mentioned this in the book, offers a nice kind of example of the ugly side of self-care, or when it becomes overly materialistic or indulgent. There are some scenes in there, and I forget the characters' names. They have this kind of treat yourself day. And I want to clarify that I'm not saying that treating yourself is bad. Sometimes we want to treat ourselves. In fact, we should probably do that every day in some sort of way. But the ways that they do it and sort of the over the top way that they're treating themselves, they buy luxury handbags for themselves. I think that they are drinking fine champagne or just different things like that, that it's clear that there's not a sense of awareness about how those actions might ripple out and affect others in their lives. And so, yeah, a sitcom maybe offers a good context. Yeah.
I love that, because I hear your point. You don't want to be judgmental or assume things, but I think we could all probably think of example of a time when there might have been some avoidance going on. You mentioned that in the book, or maybe they didn't want to deal with something. And I think most people know what you're talking about. We've probably seen that happen.
Yes, I think it is, unfortunately, a very common occurrence, that we experience this kind of downside to self-care in our society right now. And it's because of, I think, partly the either or mindset and the way that it's getting reinforced and activated by our use of self-care. And you've named something, that I forgot to name that's really important and is in the book, as you said, which is the avoidance patterns. So if that self-care is being used as a way of avoiding social interaction or connection or something that's difficult in one's life, that may be a good signal that self-care needs to be sort of examined and looked at more carefully. Yeah.
Okay. This is helpful. Now let's talk a little bit about the other end of the continuum here, which is similar to that idea of pathological altruism, which I think is a really interesting one. Could you tell us a little bit about that end of things?
Yeah. So on the other end of the continuum is when we become so other-oriented that we lose sight of our own needs and our own values and goals. And so, other terms that people, I think, are commonly using for that now are overfunctioning. I've heard that term used quite a bit recently, where people are sort of overextending themselves in one way or the other for other people's sake. And so the essential thing there is similar. And so I highlight in the book how actually we see a similar problem at either end of the extreme of the continuum, where when you go to one end of the extreme, you're losing sight of the other aspect. And so when we go too far in the direction of caring for others, that we lose sight of our own self-care, that's when it becomes unhealthy. And so examples of this are maybe in the workplace, someone working too many hours in a row and sort of neglecting, I do this sometimes where I'll just put my head down and start working and sort of lose track of time and then realize I skipped lunch, I maybe didn't even finish my coffee and now I'm depleted for the rest of the day. And maybe, there's other important tasks that I'm less nourished for, less available to others for. And so yeah, I think that this is a very common experience. And in my opinion, it's actually part of the issue is the way that we're approaching self-care culture is that we view it as toggling back and forth between these two as a kind of binary. So when we care for others, we just totally lean in and sort of full out on that in a way that we then later have to make up for with some kind of extreme self-care or something like that. Mm-hmm. And what would be better, and the we care approach I think that we'll get into, is if we can hold both self-care and care for others in our minds and in our hearts simultaneously, and then allow that to serve as a kind of dynamic tension that helps us to navigate moment by moment and not lose sight of either commitment to ourselves or commitment to others.
I want to talk about one more example before we move into we care. And this is a more extreme one that you write about that's from your life, and you write about it in the book. So you live in Boulder, and there was about 4 years ago, I think there was a mass shooting in a grocery store there. And you wrote an article in the Daily Camera newspaper, right? Afterwards, within a day or two of that horrible event. So I'm going to read a quote from it. Okay, here goes. Tragedy can make us feel pulled in two seemingly opposite directions. On one hand, our natural empathy and compassion pulls us into taking action. We want to do something, anything that might offer support and healing to those suffering most. Yet, we may also feel a pull towards something else, namely overwhelm, numbness, and less motivation to help. What researchers call empathic distress or compassion collapse. And so I think there's a lot of this going around these days when the world is feeling really hard and stressful and overwhelming for so many people. Can you talk a little bit about those two forces, kind of similar to what we were talking about, but I think just this is more in the context of these more big picture, extreme, stressful events in life.
Mm. Yeah, right. So these tendencies that we're talking about here of the extremes of self-care, divided self-care and divided other care, just get amplified in these kind of contexts where suffering is heightened. And so thank you, first of all, for reading that. I actually haven't revisited that article in quite some time, so it's nice to hear what I wrote there a little bit. And it's very consistent with chapter 1 of my book. I write about now these tendencies, as I refer to them, as the superhero and the hurt. And so that might be a helpful framing for our discussion here. But essentially, on one hand, the superhero is kind of the extreme of other-oriented care. And alongside that, we see in these sort of heightened situations of clear distress, like unfortunately this event that happened in Boulder. And I'll say, I don't know anyone who is directly impacted by that event, but I write about it in the book because, like you said, it happened so close to my own home. I couldn't help but be affected by that event very deeply. And ultimately, as I write about in the book, and I'll probably mention again here, it's what inspired me to decide to write this book. So when we're in that kind of situation where there's heightened distress or heightened suffering, the other-oriented care or that tendency to divide our other-oriented care can become even more extreme by layering on these two additional aspects, which is that that divided mode of care comes along with wanting to be really action-oriented, to take some kind of urgent action. And then we also want to be just entirely in our strength. Like we want to just be as courageous as we can be. So that's sort of one tendency. And so I lump that all into the superhero. It's other-oriented, it's action-oriented, and it really leans into being strong, wanting to show up in one's strength.
I can just chime in really quickly to say that I sometimes, when there's a national catastrophe or something, I feel like I should somehow single-handedly be able to fix that,
Yes.
So I think that would be an example of okay, what am I going to do about this? I'm going to get into activist mode and I'm going to take this on.
That's right. Yeah. The availability of news and kind of the instantaneous nature of it almost makes it feel like, that's our personal problem to solve in that moment. And we need to sort of do something to show up as much as we can for it. And I think you're exactly right that the narrative of this kind of inner part, we could say what I call a care profile within us, is when we get into that divided mode of the superhero, we really want to take action now. And we almost feel like you're saying that we can single-handedly do something. That's that strength aspect of the superhero. On the other hand, there's this potential arising within us at the same time. And so I write about how in my own experience of this Boulder shooting event, turning on the news and seeing it unfolding at a place I recognized at a grocery store just down the street from me, I felt simultaneously the hurt. And the hurt is kind of the opposite of those three things. So the hurt is more self-focused, more feeling-focused, and then leans into vulnerability very strongly. And so is almost entirely collapsing one's care into inward. And I read about sort of wanting to crawl under a rock. That part of me wanted to crawl under a rock, turn off the news, almost pretend like it wasn't happening, and more or less numb out. Now, we know from research that this second tendency of the hurt is sometimes referred to as compassion collapse in the scientific literature. And it's this sort of paradoxical effect that as the amount of suffering increases, the amount of care and compassion tends to go down on an individual level. So people are very moved and inspired to kind of help out one person when they read about someone's plight across the world, someone's difficulty or suffering across the world. But if they read about that same difficulty affecting a group of people, the research suggests they're actually less likely to feel care and compassion for that group of people, even though it's now a larger number of people suffering from the same thing. So it's a sort of paradoxical effect, and it highlights why, unfortunately, we can't just rely entirely on our natural care instincts to guide us in the complexity of care and compassion in modern life. And so ultimately, I think it's really important that we find a balance between these kind of tendencies and to not collapse our care in those moments, especially into the superhero or the hurt. If we do that, especially if we're in the midst of a real life kind of crisis situation, I think the risks are even higher. But even if we do it in the short term, I think there's this feeling of inner conflict that inevitably arises, whether in the moment or further downstream, where we recognize that we're not honoring our heart's wish for care and compassion to flow in both directions. The truth is, even though I wasn't directly affected by the King Soopers event, I was suffering that day because of how that event impacted me emotionally and psychologically and so on. So it was really important to tend to those parts of myself that were affected and to not just dismiss them because there was less suffering in them than for people who were directly affected, right? And so I think sometimes finding that balance means, getting honest about places that we are suffering and tending to those, and then being realistic about what kind of care and support we can offer in that situation while still looking after those parts of ourselves. And so for me, what happened was I sort of sat with both of those tendencies. I was able to recognize them based on this research that I've been doing and the work on compassion in our Europa mindful compassion training that I teach as a part of. I was able to sit with kind of both of those extremes and notice them as natural facets of me and not try and get rid of them or, dismiss them in any kind of way, but just allow them and accept them as parts of me, while also recognizing that neither one was the whole story. Neither one was going to offer me the pathway forward. And so I have different practices and things for sitting with that. I think that day I journaled quite a bit and I reached out to loved ones and I kind of tried to find this balance. And eventually what happened is it emerged as action of writing that article for the Boulder Daily Camera, where I felt like I could share a little bit about this research in ways that might help resource others too.
Well, let me read you one more quote from that same article. You said, an approach that balances self-compassion with compassion for others. When we balance these two orientations of compassion, we can move forward in ways that neither abandon our own suffering nor the suffering of others. Which is the perfect segue to talk about your model of we care. And so what does that mean?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. The we care framework in my book is really about presenting this new idea of we care. And we care expands upon the idea of self-care and self-compassion to bridge its principles and practices with scientific insights about our social nature. And so in contrast to, self-care alone or self-compassion alone, we care means caring for a we. And importantly, that we is flexible. So this is a nice thing about the word we. There's sort of this innate flexibility in the word we, where it can encompass just us and one other person, or us and, the entire city of Boulder or something like that during that event we were just speaking about. Or it's also flexible in the sense that we can emphasize ourselves when we need to within that we, and we can emphasize others when we need to. So in essence, then, that we care idea allows us to transform the sense of inner conflict or division between, do I care for myself or do I care for others, from a kind of either or dilemma into an ongoing both and practice. And a metaphor I like to use for it is that of breathing. So we're able to mentally divide the breath into in-breath and out-breath, but fundamentally, they're parts of one interconnected system that are important to sustain our vitality. And so similarly, self-care and care for others, I view them as parts of one interconnected or even unified system, and both are essential for supporting and sustaining our vitality. So yes, we can mentally divide care and compassion into self and other, but I actually don't think that's the best dividing line for care and compassion for ways that we might get into. And so we care, really, the spirit of it is that rather than sort of toggling back and forth between self-care and care for others to achieve some sort of ideal balance or ratio in our care, which I think is the typical narrative about how to approach these care dilemmas in our life, we care is really about holding both self-care and care for others in our hearts simultaneously and allowing that to serve as a kind of inner compass. And so I talked about already, but if you do that and you cultivate that capacity, there's a kind of dynamic tension that arises between self-care and care for others across situations. And we can use that to sort of navigate the complexity of care in daily life.
Yeah. And I can really see how this is a mindset shift, right? That you're
Yes.
instead of looking at them as conflicting and oppositional, it's like, okay, they're both related, they're connected, they kind of feed each other. In a sense.
That's right. Yeah. So we're moving more or less from the either or mindset that we were talking about, where we're either in self-care or care for others, to what I call the we care mindset. And we commit to holding both in our heart at the same time. There's sort of these natural outflows of other aspects that inform this broader we care mindset.
So I think this sounds really good in theory, but I bet listeners are sitting here wondering, okay, how do I do that? And so can we talk through a few examples of some ways to do it, or what this might actually look like in someone's real everyday life?
Absolutely. So the first thing to say about that, I think, is for most people, how they're approaching self-care is already we care by my definition. And so I think starting there is a really good starting place for most people. Typically when people are practicing self-care, they're already awake to its interconnection to their commitments to others in their life, or, how it's supporting their work in the world and that kind of thing. So more or less that fits with my definition of we care already. And I think it would be more appropriate to call that activity we care than it would be to just call it, self-care in that sort of divided way. And I think it's important to mention as well that when people begin to practice we care, it's not about compromising in any way the depth or quality of their self-care time. Often it's about leaning into it even more. But how it shows up in daily life often comes down to these kind of care dilemmas that arise. And so a simple example of this that kind of embeds many of the principles of we care within it is, imagine that you're about to sort of settle into your favorite self-care activity. Maybe it's reading your favorite book or watching your favorite TV show or taking a bath or something to that effect. And out of the blue, you get a phone call from somebody who's really important to you, who you really deeply care about. And maybe you haven't heard from them in a long time. And so in that moment of receiving that phone call, that we've probably all experienced a kind of inner conflict or tension like in a moment like that, where on one hand, we could just continue going in this direction of deeply caring for ourselves, or we could take the phone call and, show up for that connection and potentially offer care to that other person. Maybe there's some concern that why are they calling out of the blue? Maybe they need something from me, right? And so in that kind of moment, this is when the either or mindset is up for us a lot of times in our current culture around care, where we feel like we have to choose. Either I care for myself and I neglect that other person and I say no to that connection and it trades off against that connection, or I abandon myself and my self-care that I was so excited about and looking forward to and really needing, and I answer the phone call and I show up for that other person. So We Care asks us to sort of question whether those are really the only two options in that moment. So, regardless of what someone chooses to do, there's an array of other sort of middle options. Like we could, for example, send a quick text to the other person like, hey, I'm not available in this moment. I can call you back in an hour or two. Is that okay? Is it an emergency? Right? So we're at least sort of understanding, is this a situation that's urgent that this person needs to talk right now? And we're staying in connection with them, right? But we're still building in the space and advocating for ourselves and our self-care time. On the other hand, we might decide to answer that phone call and have a brief phone call, with them, and then still carve out enough time for our self-care afterwards. There's even more options, right? Like we could view that phone call as a potential self-care time. Like, oh, I actually enjoy connecting with this other person. They matter a lot to me. This is strengthening the social fabric of my life. I was thinking about doing this other self-care activity that I was excited about, but maybe I can redirect the flow of that care and use this call as an opportunity to deepen connection with both them and myself. So there's all sorts of ways that this mindset shift can support us seeing that our self-care and our care for others don't need to be in tension or in conflict with one another.
I have an example too. One is the flexibility you were talking about earlier. And there might be days when you're like, I am just really exhausted today. This self-care moment to myself is really, really important to me today. There might be another day when, like you said, maybe this friend really is having an emergency. And I think the flexibility and thinking outside of the box, like, oh, is there a way I can sort of meet both needs or, be flexible around it? Maybe I was going to, take that bubble bath now, but why can't I take it in an hour? That's fine too. Yeah. So the example I was thinking of, so one of my favorite things to do is to have time to myself. I like to journal or read or do some writing or something like that. And I have a cafe I love to go to in my neighborhood. It's a really cute little independent cafe. But my family gets really mad at me if I'm just like, ghosting them all the time. And of course, I want to spend time with my family too. It's not just about them being mad at me. It's also like quality time is important. So a lot of times what I do is I bring my kids with me to the cafe. But we kind of have this understanding. I'll buy them, they can get a chai or an Italian soda or something like that, or a hot chocolate, but they have to bring something to do. And they love it. They think it's really fun to go sit at a cafe and, they read or draw or do their homework or something like that. But I get a little bit of that time and there's a little bit of, I'm interrupted. They interrupt me a lot. So it's not really the same, but it's also a fun thing. We walk there from my house and we enjoy it, but it kind of allows for a little bit of both at once.
Yeah, I love that example. And it highlights something that maybe it's good to get into this depth in this conversation, which is different ways that we can integrate self-care and care for others. So as you're highlighting, sometimes we do really need to emphasize self-care, and sometimes even fiercely so in the midst of a situation where someone's trying to take advantage of us, or we need to set a strong boundary or something to that effect. So We Care maintains that flexibility of being able to emphasize without polarizing our care. So I like to use that phrase. It's emphasize, don't polarize your care. And so in your example, sometimes you still do want to go to the cafe by yourself, and you want to do that without interruption. And that's really essential to your well-being. And you understand and can easily trace how taking that time to yourself, even if, you might get some friction in the form of family members texting or that kind of thing, you recognize that nourishing yourself in that way is allowing you to show up more fully for them. And so it's probably aligned with and consistent with your care to your family members ultimately. But that would be a form of what I call sequencing. So sequencing is when we sequence our self-care and care for others, where we do one, or sort of anticipating that by doing it in that moment, it's going to support the other tendency in a different moment. So I'll go to the cafe, this morning, but then this afternoon, I'll spend time with my family. What you're highlighting is a different strategy that I call blending, which is a kind of creative combination between self-care and care for others. And yeah, it's true that when we do the kind of blending strategy, there sometimes is a little bit of a shift in how that self-care time is experienced or how our care for others is experienced. But I love the creativity of the combination, and it highlights how if we just slow down a little bit and we reflect on these care dilemmas, not just through the lens of the either or mindset, but through this broader mindset of being awake to these creative middles of we care, then it's possible for us to come up with solutions to these care dilemmas that honor both us and others.
Okay, I want to change topic slightly now, because sometimes I get a little bit confused about words that are used a lot, which I know these words. I'm a therapist, right? But words like empathy, compassion, self-compassion, compassion fatigue, empathic distress. And you have a section in your book about the empathy and compassion gap. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what these terms mean and what is the empathy compassion gap? And what are your thoughts on how to think about this in a sustainable way?
Right. Yeah. Thank you for this question. And it's one of my favorite topics to discuss because, again, I don't think you're alone in kind of struggling with distinguishing between these terms. And in fact, a big part of our Naropa Mindful Compassion training has to do with teaching about the differences between, in our own lived experience, empathy and compassion, so that we're not just conceptually disentangling them, but we can actually experientially feel into the different qualities of empathy versus compassion. And I have a little activity or exercise that maybe we'll get into around that.
Oh, yes. And I'll mention that your book is filled with some practices and exercises that people can do. So little side note there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, I really aimed with the book, even though, science is in the title and that kind of thing, I aimed to make it something that people can dive into, a practice here and there, or they can read about the science behind something. They can kind of go where they want to and choose their own adventure, so to speak. But yeah, there's a chapter on the empathy compassion gap. Empathy is a natural automatic response that tends to occur. We'll talk about it in the context of suffering. So when another person is going through a difficult time, maybe you can think of someone like this in your life right now who's going through difficulty. There's kind of a natural way that your heart resonates with theirs. And it's often referred to in the literature as feeling with others. And so we know that they're going through a difficult time, and we're able to, in some sense, resonate with that difficult time as well, emotionally or psychologically, and feel into it to a certain degree. It's a subtler form of that kind of suffering usually, but we're feeling what they are feeling. And so that starting point of empathy is a really important bridge for fulfilling our connection needs. And it serves as a kind of glue in social interactions that allows us to feel a sense of intimacy with others. But what the research suggests is when someone's suffering, if we stay in just that empathic response and we don't transform that empathy into compassion, then it risks what's called empathic distress. And empathic distress is more or less that, okay, now I've felt so much of what you're feeling and the difficulty of what you're feeling that I'm now in distress too. And so now there's not just one person suffering, there's two people suffering. And interestingly, research suggests that when we're in a state of empathic distress, we're actually less motivated to help the other person because we're now dysregulated personally, and we're having to turn our attention inward and focus on personal emotion regulation instead of social emotion regulation or a more altruistic response. And so compassion is really about transforming that initial empathy for suffering into a willingness to take action and to feel for the other person, not just feel with the other person. And so sometimes our empathy will be activated in situations where we can't take deliberate action, and compassion still applies in those situations. So why don't we do a little bit of this activity, and I'll help people feel into the difference between feeling with and feeling for. So I just said a moment ago that you can probably think of someone in your life who's going through a difficult time. We'll call this your empathy spark. So if you can think about someone like that in your life, or maybe a recent news story that you read where people were really going through something challenging, or they were negatively affected by things happening in the world or something like that, and just feel what it feels like to call them to mind, to relate to that sense of them going through difficulty. And often people report, when I ask them qualities of this, they feel a kind of heaviness in their body, like a sinking in. They may feel pain, discomfort of relating to that. And so we're feeling with, that's our natural empathy response. Okay, so we'll drop that for a moment. And now we'll do something that I call your compassion spark. And so your compassion spark isn't the full expression of compassion, and we can get into that, but it's an access point for feeling into the difference between empathy and compassion. And so rather than thinking about someone who's suffering, I want you to instead think of or call to mind someone or something that you feel naturally warms your heart when you call it to mind. Now, research suggests that often for people, this is a pet or an animal. So if that's happening for you, that's no problem. Research suggests it's actually a little bit easier for us to initially access these feelings of warmth and affiliative emotion when we call to mind an animal than another human being. Allow yourself to call that being, or you could call a memory to mind, like maybe a cherished holiday memory. It could be a gesture, like I'm putting my hand on my heart, that helps you connect with that warmth. But is there something you can think of that when you bring it to mind, you feel in touch with that warmth? For me, my brother's dog is now grown older. His name's Thompson, but I think about him as a little puppy, and I feel in touch with that warmth in my heart. And so when we're accessing this warmth, we're getting in touch with this feeling for aspect of compassion. And essentially through compassion training and through getting more familiar with the distinction between empathy and compassion, we're more and more able to self-activate this feeling of warmth in the midst of suffering. So if another person's suffering, or even if we're suffering, we're able to evoke this inner warmth and meet that moment with a sense of open-heartedness. And there's a quality usually of a buffer that's sort of provided by that warmth between the suffering and kind of our inner selves. So there's this feeling like the warmth is able to hold the suffering and not sort of collapse into it. And so that sort of self-activation of affiliative emotion, researchers would refer to this as proactive emotion generation. And then it also involves some emotion regulation, because once you activate that warmth, then you sort of want to keep it alive in your experience. But that allows you to sort of stay engaged with the suffering without closing your heart. And the research suggests that it's better for you and it's better for others. You're more likely to take inspired action to actually help alleviate the pain when you are feeling for, not just feeling with.
I love that, because I think sometimes what will happen is that I get so overwhelmed by it that I feel like, well, I don't know what to do. Maybe I get a little perfectionistic almost or something. And then I just do nothing and I shut down, but I'm kind of spinning around with it. I'm all upset or I'm feeling terrible about it. But then there's extra layer of feeling guilty, because I'm kind of like, well, what's wrong with me? I'm not really showing up here. I'm not doing anything helpful. And so I think that just taking that moment to create that space there, it just allows you to kind of shift, get a different perspective on it, which kind of frees you up a little bit from that spiral I'm talking about.
That's right. Another way of looking at it is that when our empathy for suffering gets activated, not only is it a negative emotional experience initially, but if we stay in the either or mindset around it, it can become a kind of divided mode of care where we feel dysregulated, like we feel inner conflict. Let's say that we're passing by a houseless person on the street who's really suffering and going through difficulty, but maybe we're on our way to work or we're in kind of a hurry or something like that, and we're not able to actually tend to that situation. And so our heart gets activated, and then we don't quite know what to do with it, because we feel like we want to do something to help that individual, but either we don't have time, or, we already helped someone in this kind of way earlier in the week, or our commitments are to other things at this time. And so we feel a sense of inner conflict. And ultimately what happens in that state of inner conflict is dysregulation grows. because the negative emotion is just kind of bouncing around in us, and it's not leading to a clarity of action or direction or internal alignment. And so what compassion does is it allows us to actually embrace that experience of our vulnerability. Oh, we were affected by the situation, and it's natural for us to resonate with the suffering of this houseless person who we don't know. That's actually a natural part of our caring system, and it's hardwired into us. And so rather than resisting that experience and trying to get rid of it in some sense, or on the other hand, feeling like we have to do something to sort of act on this emotion right now, compassion allows us to meet that with this wish for that other person's well-being, even if in the moment we're not able to take action to help them. And I believe, and I think that we probably have all experienced, that when we can meet moments like that with that kind of inner wish, oftentimes that does lead to more inspired action that helps, similar others, or even maybe that person who is going through difficulty into the future. And so, compassion doesn't always mean that you take action in that exact moment to help that exact individual, but it allows us to stay open to the suffering of the world without collapsing our care in one direction or the other.
That's right. It's a lot better than just turning callous about it and who cares,
Mm-hmm.
or, to kind of get into that mindset, which is not helpful to the world. And so,
That's right.
Well, and let's talk about boundaries, because you have a chapter on boundary setting and you emphasize the importance of setting these healthy, sort of care-oriented boundaries. I want to read a quote that you put on social media and apparently went viral, which I think is pretty cool. Here's the quote. "Each time you set a good boundary, an energy vampire loses a fang." So I think that you're talking about these, people and situations that deplete our energy here. So tell us a little bit about what healthy sort of care-based boundaries might look like and how they can help sustain us.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. And I'll just mention that actually my journey to We Care really started with an investigation of what was meant by healthy boundaries. So I was training to be a therapist now over a decade ago, and I was encountering difficulty with my own sense of boundaries, especially when I was, in session or sitting with someone who was in distress. And there was a lot of discussion about, you need to cultivate healthy boundaries. You need to get better at sort of balancing the sense of self-attunement with attunement to others. And I thought, well, how do you actually do that? And what are these things that we're calling boundaries? There's a lot of discussion around it. So I went to the scientific literature, which even at that time was a place that I normally went to find clarity. And I was surprised that there was very little consensus on what boundaries were. And there was actually very little scientific research on the topic at all. And so, believe it or not, at that point, I thought, well, this is the whole job. I'm meant to be a therapist. I need to be able to be good at this. I pivoted my career in the direction of scientific research, and I decided to pursue a PhD, in part to see if I couldn't, crack this puzzle or solve this puzzle of what healthy boundaries were. And it took quite a bit longer than I anticipated. And it wasn't until I came to Naropa as a faculty member and joined the teaching team for Naropa Mindful Compassion Training Program that I was preparing for class one day, and I was doing some research on compassion and self-compassion. And I had a recognition about compassion and the way that we were framing this difference between self-compassion and compassion for others that I read about in the book sort of rotated all my other thoughts about care and compassion. And at that point, I realized that this puzzle that I had been trying to solve around what healthy boundaries were for over a decade was actually about something more expansive that I now, have written this book about We Care. And so my answer to what healthy boundaries are and how to give rise to them is really shaped and informed by my understanding of We Care for those reasons. And I think that it's a little bit different, or maybe even quite a bit different than how we typically talk about boundaries in modern life. My approach emphasizes cultivating and developing healthy boundaries from the inside out. And so I now believe it's possible to sort of work on these inner qualities, especially cultivating deeply, self-care, self-compassion, and then care for others and compassion for others. And if we cultivate those in the right way, where they're in relationship to one another. They're parts of this interconnected care system that We Care framework offers perspective on. Then in any given moment, as I was speaking about earlier, we experience in the midst of, someone does something that, is harming our well-being or putting that at risk. We experience that dynamic tension. Like, I really care for this other person and I value the actions that they're taking in this moment to look out for their own well-being. But I'm feeling that they're not quite aware of the impact of their actions on me in this moment, right? So we have that kind of sense of perspective taking because we have that care for others that's awake and available. And we haven't abandoned ourselves because we're awake to self-compassion and self-care and how the situation and this other person's actions are impacting us. So we feel this kind of, in that moment, we feel both of those things at the same time. And then we begin to seek actions that are aligned with what I call as like an inner compass of care that arises from feeling both self-care and care for others simultaneously. And so we begin to search for possible actions that we might take. Maybe it's that we need to verbally express something to that other person. Maybe we need to take a walk around the block and come back once we've had a breath of fresh air because we, need the space to kind of process what occurred. But we take aligned actions that find somehow a way of honoring both our care and understanding of where that other person's coming from and our own needs, goals, and values in that situation. So that's the first thing to say, is that I really think healthy boundaries can be cultivated naturally from the inside out. And We Care, I believe, is a key approach to that. Then the boundaries are care-based. And so another sort of difference in my approach compared to how I see it represented in other places is this idea that boundaries are always an expression of self-care and that they're meant to sort of protect us. They're more protective actions. And I think instead, when we approach boundaries from a We Care perspective, we use care-based language. And so we're able to speak to how that situation may be impacting our own well-being and the well-being of the person that we're relating to. But more than that, because situations are complicated and social situations in our life can become quite complex and nuanced with regard to boundaries, we're able to hold in our hearts the sort of wider social fabric of our life and understand how maybe this one person who we're in relationship with is impacting our well-being and our sense of resourcefulness in ways that are making it difficult for us to show up for everyone else in our life that we care deeply about. And then from that sort of socially resourced perspective, we're able to speak care-based words or, take care-based actions to advocate for ourselves and that wider social fabric of our life so that we don't abandon, all of those other people in our lives. And so I really think that this narrative that boundaries are actions of self-care can make people feel guilty when they're setting boundaries. Like, I'm just doing this for me, or I'm needing to take this action because this is impacting my well-being. When in truth, again, if we zoom out a little bit, we see that setting a boundary is almost always an expression of our care for many.
Yes. I was thinking about how in relationships I've had where I wasn't great about setting boundaries and the other person wanted a lot from me, the relationship ultimately suffers because it's not sustainable or it's not a healthy relationship. And so in a way it's good for everyone. And then, like you said, for the greater good as well. So I think that's really important. Yeah. It's not just a self-care or a selfish act. It's actually necessary.
Yeah, then I think that there's another either or that we can fall into with regard to boundaries. And I'd like to, this isn't as evident in the book, but I like to increasingly share this perspective, which is an either or between protection and connection. So I do have that represented in the book, I think in chapter 6. But especially with regard to boundaries, I think we can get into an either or mindset where we feel like I either have to be in a mode of protection or I have to be in a mode of connection. And I think healthy boundaries allow us to do both so that we can protect ourselves and advocate for ourselves across different situations while also promoting and supporting connection. Maybe it's not directly connection with that individual we're having to set the boundary with, although it often is, as you're saying, like in close relationships, if you don't have healthy boundaries, that usually comes at the expense of connection. So ultimately, I think care-based boundaries allow us to find this balance and sometimes even synergy between protection and connection.
That's right. Yeah. That's back to that mindset shift around how we're looking at this and actually, acknowledging that connection. So the final question I want to ask you just to end on, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the event in Boulder and what you wrote in the Daily Camera, which is just, the world is stressful and complicated. I think a lot of people are struggling with this idea of how do I sustain myself through all the problems in the world and keep going in my own life and take care of myself and also have a positive impact on the world. And I know this is a really big question to end on here, but do you have any words of wisdom? How are you navigating that in your own life? Or what would you say to someone who's grappling with that right at this particular moment in history?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And yes, so important to be discussing this, like at the inner side of our outer life and what's happening in society. In the final chapter of my book, I do address this. I introduce a new idea to distinguish between compassion collapse that we talked about earlier, which again, as a reminder, is when suffering increases to such a great degree, like the cause that we're focused on, say something like climate change. There's so much suffering that we can sort of resonate with and hold in our heart from a situation like that, that it's really becomes possible for people to kind of numb out or check out to that amount of suffering. So their compassion collapses. They become less likely to actually pay attention to that cause and be willing to take actions. On the other hand, some people, I think, fall into what I call care bypassing, which I consider to be kind of a mirror image of compassion collapse that's in the other direction on the care continuum, which is if we are able to keep our heart open to a problem or a cause that's as big as something like climate change or a humanitarian crisis. I read about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan in the book. Then there's a different kind of risk, which is that in caring for something so big with so much suffering, it may be difficult sometimes to justify smaller acts of care in our daily life that are important for tending to our own well-being along the way. So, if there's an important rally or an event coming up to support that or some kind of action that we, can take in that moment, there's this risk that our care extends so much to that bigger cause that we feel like looking after and caring for ourselves is unimportant or not valuable because we're just one person and that cause or that thing that we're focused on is affecting maybe even millions of people. And so I write about in the book, it's important to find a healthy balance, and I think that We Care offers a path between these two extremes where we can keep our heart open to these bigger causes, but we understand the more essential value of caring for ourselves. And I'll mention as well, caring for our local communities or our families or our close relationships along the way, and to not underestimate the value of those smaller acts of care on the wider fabric of society. And we can do this by understanding that each moment that we choose to care for ourselves from a We Care perspective, that's sitting at the nexus of us and many other people. That act of care is, by definition, a social phenomena. And it is impacting not just our own well-being in that moment, but it's having ripple effects. And in fact, there's interesting research that I get into in the book on how our acts of care are contagious. So even our acts of self-care tend to increase the likelihood that those around us will practice deeper self-care as well and prioritize that. So I think that we can fall into, again, this kind of either or mindset of either I have to care for this cause, sort of halfway around the world, or maybe it's a political thing that's happening nationally or something like that. And I have to put all my energy toward that and kind of neglect my own needs. Or, I'm tending to myself and I'm prioritizing myself in this moment. And then I'm feeling guilty because I'm not participating in that wider movement. And fortunately, from a We Care perspective, we don't have to choose. We can tend to those acts of self-care on a daily basis, understanding that they're not just for our own benefit, but that they're strengthening the social fabric of society. And that will nourish us in ways that allow us to stay committed to those causes in a more sustainable way.
Yes, sustainable. I love that. In my burnout work, I wrote about activist burnout. And I think it's very important to sustain yourself.
Yes.
Even if you do care deeply and you are trying to have a positive impact on the world, you have to keep it sustainable. Yeah. Well, Jordan, there was so much richness and depth in this conversation. I really appreciate it. It's just given me so much to think about and apply in my life. And I really recommend the book for people because you go into topics that we didn't even get to today, whole chapters in your book that we didn't cover that I think have a similar, relevance to people. And so I highly recommend checking it out, From Self-Care to We Care. And Jordan will link to your book and we'll link to your website. And I just really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. And thanks for all the wonderful questions.
Okay, well, we just listened to my conversation with Jordan, and I am here with Michael to discuss the episode a little bit. So why don't we start with you? What did you think about the conversation with Jordan?
Well, I have to say that I loved the conversation, of course. And the first thing that came to my mind when you talked about this topic and how self-care and we care works either together or in parallel, the first thing that came to mind was one of my favorite authors in the world. You might have heard of her. Her name is Yael Schönbrunn, and she wrote this phenomenal book, Work, Parent, Thrive, which follows the same train of thought in it, where she writes that working and parenting and thriving need not be a zero-sum game, but they can enrich each other and add to each other. And Jordan makes a similar point with self-care and we care, and how they might be a zero-sum game, but they could also enrich each other if you bring the right mindset and the right tools to the table.
I had the exact same thought as I was reading Jordan's book and talking to him. First of all, he's a really lovely human being. And
such a nice guy. Yeah.
Such a nice guy. And I felt so inspired by his work. And, we tend to think of self-care versus caregiving to others as a conflict. We also tend to think of work and parenting and caregiving as in conflict with each other. And if we can instead think about the ways in which they work together, it actually frees us up and makes both more enriching.
Yeah, that was the big takeaway for me from this interview, this idea that sometimes all it takes is a little bit of a mindset shift to bring that power in. So as I was listening to the interview, there was also a question that came up for me that I want to direct, not at Jordan, but I want to direct at you. And this is how you approached or how you learned about taking care of others, which comes with your profession and then also with being a mom, and taking care of yourself, which often doesn't come easy to us. What is your own evolutionary learning curve around that?
Well, that's a complicated question. And I would say it's a process and also an ongoing work in progress for me, because I do think that, like a lot of people out there, I really got good at working hard and putting my nose to the grindstone and saying yes to things that people ask me to do, and people pleasing and caregiving and that type of thing. And I have, as you know, from my burnout work, I have hit patches where it was too much and it wasn't sustainable and I was exhausted. And I think for me, it was a pretty big shift to slow down and say no to things and set boundaries and prioritize self-care. And I wouldn't say that I have this all figured out by any means, but I do think that as I've gotten older and I've learned that this is important, I think I've made small changes here and there, carving out some time to myself in the morning, prioritizing sleep, giving myself permission, I think, to do things like do some writing, journaling, go for a walk, that type of thing, that actually it matters. And so again, it's not like I've got this all mastered by any means or anything like that, but I think over the course of time, I have recognized the importance of it. And just through small steps, I've gotten better about it. I've freed up from some of those cultural narratives about hard work and rest and kind of learn to value that. And I appreciate the people who have taught me about that as well. This is something we've talked about on the podcast before. What are your thoughts on that, Michael?
So the interesting thing for me is that I am a recovering people pleaser. And so for me, people pleasing often taps into the we care kind of domain of things for me. And I've had to learn to put the metaphorical foot down and switch things over more to the self-care. And it was just a few weeks ago, made a tough decision regarding my own leisure time, where I had a bi-weekly game night that I organized together with friends. And we all got a lot out of it. And I could see my friends really relaxed and have a good time, and also process a lot of the difficult stuff that might have happened in their work and whatever. It was just a time for us all to get together and kind of take care of each other. And I realized that I need to take more care of myself, and I need to switch over. I need to turn the dial more towards self-care with a heavy heart, saying no to that time to prioritize my own battery and my own well-being. And while that bi-weekly game night might now turn into a bi-weekly Michael sits on the couch and watches a movie, which is that's a weird trait, having friends over compared to watching a movie on your own. That's sad. No, it's not, because I need it. I need that self-care, and I need that solitude and that recharging. And hey, if I'm wrong, I'll bring the games back. But for now, it feels like it needs to shift more into that direction.
Well, it's all about flexibility, right? And there's a time and a place for both. And I think maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, the game night was really important, but then there's a time and a place for taking a look at that and making a hard decision. I think that's a really important piece of what you're talking about, is that sometimes it's a hard decision. You're giving something up, but you're doing it for a reason, because at this moment, maybe you need to recharge more than you need to host an event. And both are important at different times. Yeah.
And what makes it so difficult is that when you give something up, you almost give something up for others, because I'm not taking it away from myself, right? It's not Michael who's saying, Michael, you know what? You're going to play less, PlayStation. It's no, I'm taking this away from my friends. I'm taking this away from people that I love in order to, air quotes, selfishly take care of myself in solo activities, which makes it really hard. And this is why this was something that's been going on for 6 months, where I was contemplating to make that change. And I think in that regard, it's also important to recognize that changes never need to be permanent. And also that we will never make the perfect decision in that regard.
Well, and this idea that there is a perfect decision for something like that, I think that there is no perfect. And so,
there's no.
I think it's, we're all doing the best we can here and making these hard decisions.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, thanks, Michael. And thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.